Oh my gosh, I was doing the whole meeting on mute. I'm so sorry. But today's discussion is about Indigenous people and the Hyde Amendment. And let's go over here. We are an Indigenous women-led organization, and we've been around for over 30 years now, serving Indigenous communities. We were under the name the Southwest Indigenous Uranium Forum, and we currently became a 501c3 in 2016, and we began our journey under the name of Indigenous Lifeways. And we're so thankful for your time today to begin this learning session. And today's discussion is more about certain policies that affect Indigenous women and life givers, birth givers in our communities. But our organization is deeply rooted in exposing environmental racism and gaining environmental justice. So we know that violence against our Mother Earth is violence against our women. So that's why we're here today exposing certain amendments and certain policies that directly impact Indigenous communities. And this is a photo back in 2021, last year. Time has flown, but a lot has happened within this last year. But during the legislative session for New Mexico, Indigenous Lifeways was able to be an expert witness for the Respect New Mexico Women and Families Act, and it was signed by our governor last session. And the act ensures that pregnant people have access to safe and legal abortion. And we know that Indigenous communities, we have some of the hardest access avenues to healthcare and especially reproductive justice. And more about myself, my name is Crystal Curley, and I'm the executive director of Indigenous Lifeways. And I grew up in a community called Chicholta, New Mexico. It's about 20 miles south of Gallup, and I have 4 daughters and 1 son, and 3 of them I gave birth to, 3 of my daughters. And something that has led me to these discussions and motivated me to be involved in my community is my grandmother, Gertrude Henderson Rondon, and my mother, Anna Rondon. They're from Chicholta. And also my Nellie is Martina Curley of Coyote Canyon. And also my clans are Kinyani Nishlan, Kitley Chini Bushishin, Kaidene Dashiche, Anohan and Gutni Dashnella. And I also have a huge passion in filmmaking and making sure that Indigenous narrative is always being taking space in all levels that we can, whether we're speaking with our family members or in our local communities, if we're on the radio or through social media, any way that we're able to ensure our voices are being heard. I'm just a huge advocate for storytelling. And I was able to get my bachelor's in film production. And so merging those two worlds together is my biggest passion of community organizing and filmmaking. And we're going to go through several chapters and different ways of talking about this subject. And I think the way we talk about certain issues, we have to start off with knowing the lens of Indigenous people first and foremost. Before we get into how the Hyde Amendment affects us, we have to know the community we're talking about. And we're going to be speaking mostly about Indigenous women and the roles that we have within our communities. And so when I started off the presentation, I introduced myself, and that is a big part of our upbringing for Navajo people and all Indigenous people, is knowing our clans and who we represent. For Dene, we go through our matrilineal, our matriarch clans are represented in all 4 of our clans. And you can see a chart of how our kinship system works and how we're all related. There's no thing as like great aunt or great uncle. They're just known as your grandma and grandpas. There's no such thing as great niece or great nephew. It's just your daughter or your son. And so again, like a lot of our foundations are based in this family dynamic, and each of our family members plays a really significant role, and there's different dynamics that happen between each member of the family. And just for an example of what that looks like, that I like to use because I see it a lot in my family, is the relationship of your maternal uncle and the niece, and that would be my brother and my daughter's relationship. And the uncle is seen as the niece is a mother. It's called Shimayeje, and they see her as the I'm pretty sure I'm saying it right. If not, I think I am saying it. It's Shimayeje is I think is your aunt, but I think I'm not seeing the niece. But if someone wants to correct me in the chat or want to unmute and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I was taught is that the niece is like this little mother figure to the uncle. So the niece is supposed to take care of the uncle, and they have like this different relationship, and the uncle is seen like a little son in the niece's eyes. And I think naturally that kind of happens because my daughter, I'm the oldest sister, and so my little brother, I'm always kind of watching him, and I think my daughters kind of take on that role and kind of nurture him in that way. And so that's something that I was taught growing up. I don't know the terms, and I'm pretty sure I messed it up at the beginning. But definitely correct me if I'm wrong. But just knowing that each family member has a unique role and relationship to all of the family is something that is I think just natural in the way we communicate with each other. And a lot of the decision-making power is under the grandmothers and the mothers of the family. And we know that all of our matriarchs hold the last word, and their word is law in our eyes. And whatever they say goes. And I think a lot of us go to our grandmothers to decide what's happening with the land or with any kind of family matters. Within my family, my grandmother, she was the oldest of her brothers and sisters. And so, and she helped raise each of them. And so I think having those teachings from my grandmother and knowing her role as being the oldest sister, and being a caretaker to her family, there was a huge responsibility behind that, and knowing that she was going to be in that position as her mother and grandmothers before her. So I think, a lot of us hold our grandmother's words and their teachings so close. And I think, for me personally, um, I try and do as much work as I can through the lens of my grandmother and through those teachings of um, the matriarchy, and it's more of a holistic view of everything. And most recently, we had a incredible discussion with Jacqueline from Grown Up Navajo, and she came up with this concept of matriarchy. And I think that is where we're headed to in this next slide, because it talks more about the inclusive. Oh my gosh, it's late in the day. Inclusive. Oh my gosh, I cannot say that word right now, but being inclusive of our two-spirit relatives. And I think that's where our conversation, and I think where our thoughts should be more, I think that describes our kinship system a little bit better. Although the matriarchs hold the highest word, we also take high consideration of what our two-spirit relatives think as well. And so as you're growing up as a young person, there's a moment that's really pivotal, and that's when you have your puberty ceremony. And it's a time where we believe that this young person embodies the holy deities at that time. They're considered very sacred. We know that the holy people, we believe that they become the holy people, and that they bring in this huge power. So during this time of having your menstrual cycle, or boys going through puberty stages, they both have their puberty ceremony. And it's a very holistic point of view. It includes your mind, your body, your spirit, and the whole family is involved, the community is involved. And I think, through these teachings, and from what I was taught growing up, is that we're not just born as a man or as a woman. What my grandmother taught me is that we're born both feminine and masculine. We have both of those energies. And the teachings of Hajan and having that harmony and balance is that balance of that feminine and masculine energy. And I think those teachings, we see it in all natural worlds, and we see it in our plants, we see it in our ceremonies, we see it in our jewelry, our Mother Earth, our Father Sky. Certain landscapes and mountains, mesas, represent female, masculine energies, and they're also seen in different forms. From aerial point of view, you could see a woman in certain mountains, or a man in certain mountains or mesas. Our homes, some of them are female and male hogans. We also have the sweat lodge is female and male sweat lodges. So we have traditional creation stories of how our bodies were made, how the sexes came to be, our sexuality. And I think throughout all of the stories, there's a real emphasis on how unique of the abilities of our two-spirit relatives in our communities, and the importance they have within our family, and within our communities as well. And so I think that's where it becomes more holistic. It's not just one person, calling all the shots for the community. It's not anything like that. It's very inclusive of everyone in the community. And I think that's not really talked about, and not really, I think there's kind of a stigma now about our sexuality and how we talk about sex, and our lack of talking about our traditional stories and the stories of Coyote. And there's a book called the Nebahanet, the Navajo creation story, and it's very explicit. And and I know why my mom never told me to read that book as a young person. I was like, that's such a cool book, but what reading it is very explicit. It's very sexual, very, it talks about how we were created, and everything. And I think that's the most incredible thing about our culture, is that we're not afraid to speak about it. And our creation stories say it. It's a generational thing. And to see how colonization has affected that, and where's a stigma around it, it's shows why there's such a negative feeling about talking about sex now compared to before colonization. And so now we're going to move on to chapter 2. And this is about the injustice on Indigenous life givers. And we're going to be looking at historical moments leading up to Hyde. So this is more of a history, certain moments that really were pivotal, that kind of put us in a position to where we're at now. And so from 1492 to 1776, Western patriarchy oppressed Indigenous women and targeted our existence. When colonizers experienced our society, they recognized the power Indigenous women had. Therefore, Indigenous women were a direct threat to their agenda. And there's also no female pronouns in the Constitution. From during the 1800s and the 1900s, there was quite a bit of policies that affected us and took away our culture and our way of life. And we call them RAP policies. And it's the relocation, assimilation, and termination policies. It's relocating our people, it's the assimilation through boarding schools, and it's the Termination Act as well. And so these forced our families to be separated and removed off our land. We face physical, mental, and sexual abuse. We're forced to convert to Christianity or Catholic religion. And this ultimately altered our perception of women and led to the decline of Indigenous traditional practices. And from the 1950s to the 1960s, there was a birth control study done in Puerto Rico, and they were used as pretty much guinea pigs for birth control. And they chose Puerto Rico because of their mixed blood, and a lot faced many adverse effects. Just from being sterile, and some from passing. And when the situation happened, a lot of the deaths were unsolved and never investigated. And so at the almost around the same time here in the US, during the 1960s and 1970s. There was forced sterilization done in the IHS clinics and hospitals, and they targeted a lot of low-income women of color. Indigenous women were misled to have medical procedures that would make them, but would end up making them sterile. And the thing was that Native women should have less children so that they will become wealthy. And this was a notion pretty much to get, also mislead people toward capitalism more than seeing family as a value. It was more changing the perception to wealth. And this is a diagram of what they were using during that time and the propaganda that was being given out during that time in IHS. And this was the pamphlet. You could see here on this side, there's a family, and the wealth is based on how much livestock you have. And so, the less kids you're able to have, then the more wealthy in the livestock you have. And the more kids you have, the less wealth you'll have. And let's see here, I think I went back a little bit. And so some of the stereotypes here, one of the stereotypes is Native women do not have abortions. And the truth is Indigenous communities believe women have the capacity to make complex decisions to have an abortion. There was herbal remedies for abortion and fertility, and there was holistic aftercare was also performed for both situations. Whether if you decided to go the route of abortion or have the resources to become fertile. And, there was a holistic view of making sure the individual was taken care of in both situations. And there was certain life and health factors that affected a woman's decision. There was, during war times was a time where abortion was chosen mostly due to the fact that women were on the run. And so there's stories of women, taking certain herbs and foregoing that route. And we know that from birth, and that each person has their own bodily autonomy and has that self-determination from birth. And so another stereotype that we like to expose is Native women cannot be leaders. And the truth is Indigenous women are leaders within their own family unit and our community. Indigenous women lead their families and communities through healing and through war. Majority of our Indigenous women are the breadwinners in our family. And also, should add another point here, is that a lot of our holy people are Indigenous women, and they have paved the way for us. And they're women like Changed Woman and White Shell Woman and Spider Woman, and they have places on Navajo where they're born, where they come from, where they dwell, and these are considered sacred sites. So there's that I would like to add under that bulletin point as well. And so this gets us to our third chapter, is the Hyde Amendment, and the Hyde Amendment and how it affects Indigenous people. Okay, so the Hyde Amendment of 1976, and this is a quote from Henry Hyde himself. I certainly would like to prevent, if I could legally, anybody having an abortion, a rich woman, a middle-class woman, or a poor woman. Unfortunately, the only vehicle available is the medical bill. And Henry Hyde. Oh, the Hyde Amendment, created by Henry Hyde himself, it prohibits the use of federal funding for abortions with the exception of rape or incest. This was developed in spite of Roe v. Wade, which is a ruling done 3 years prior in 1973. Roe v. Wade constitutionally protects women, pregnant women, and their choice of having an abortion without government restrictions and interference. And we know that recently Roe v. Wade has been overturned. And so that is another discussion we'll have a follow-up on, but that's a whole nother can of worms. Right here as well, this is how the Hyde Amendment affects low-income women of color. And these are the federal funding avenues that cannot use any federal funding for abortion. And folks that receive, these are all folks that have, and not folks, but these are entities that all receive federal funding. So if you're a person that has the capacity for pregnancy and you are getting services from any of these entities, you do not have any access to abortion whatsoever. So if you are a person who has a womb and you go to IHS, you do not have access to abortion. Or if you're in a federal prison, or if you receive Medicare or Medicaid, if you serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, or if you're a veteran, if you're a woman in the Peace Corps or in immigrant facility, if you're a federal employee, and children that have health insurance as well are also unable to access abortion. And so here is a diagram of how the Hyde Amendment affects each state. And so for us in New Mexico, we're very unique because we do have laws around Medicaid, and we do have funding under Medicaid, which allows folks in New Mexico who do have Medicaid, they are able to get abortion and get it paid through Medicaid if you are New Mexico. And so these are all the states in blue that also have the same type of access as New Mexico. And the orange states are the states that follow the Hyde restrictions. The state in red is the most restrictive. Oh, it's more restrictive than the federal standard. And so this also shows how important the Hyde Amendment plays. Medicaid plays an important role for women who are poor or a minority. And so you can see how it's played out here through poverty level and through race as well. And so for us as Indigenous people, we have the least access to abortion care access or reproductive health care access as well. And so there's many barriers for us to even get that access. And some of the barriers are living in rural areas. There's long distance to travel to receive medical services. There's a lack of or no transportation. We're come from low income communities. There's lack of resources. We're survivors of abuse, rape, incest, and sexual assault. We're unaware of abortion services or lack of services in our communities. We also experience environmental exposures of extraction industry like coal, oil, and gas, uranium, and fracking. And we have limited access to clean water. And when we're under these situations, sometimes we're forced to give birth to unwanted pregnancies. And so the question is, what do we do now? And here are some ways that you can make a difference, and just very simple. This is something I think it's a lot to tackle this, but I think some of the easiest things that we can do and help our communities and help our families is learn more about abortion services within New Mexico and within our communities, and be able to help those that may need that access. You can also support local abortion funds and organizations. And the main reason why we're here is to end abortion stigma and be able to talk about it more freely among our communities and within our families and within the life givers, and future life givers as well. And we highly encourage that you do advocate for any call to actions that are within your district, within your state, and at any federal level. And I think right now, one of the current calls to action is highlighting Roe v. Wade and how we can navigate post decision, and how we are able to provide more access to families. And here's a list of some more resources about the Hyde Amendment, and some more resources also about Roe v. Wade and some of the historical moments that we discussed as well. And I think this wraps up our recorded session. I'm going to get off now, but I just want to thank everyone for joining us today's learning session today. Thank you so much. And
Crystal.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I wanted to ask, so the Hyde Amendment is like a old version of Roe versus Wade?
So this Roe v. Wade was done in 1973, and 3 years later in 76, the Hyde Amendment was made in spite of Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade protected our rights, our abortion rights, and protected women. And so what Henry Hyde did was limit that access through the Hyde Amendment. And yeah, and I'll also share the slides with everyone as well to refer back to. But yeah, that is such a great question, because the timelines can get really confusing when we're talking about reproductive justice as well.
They even ask about making a reproductive health care center when it's so far away from where people actually need it. Like, why is it so close to the border? Then it